All right, so welcome everybody to this event, which is a youth conference on tackling disinformation. My name is Omri Price. I'm the Managing Director of Alliance for Europe, and we're very happy to be here with Sigma, the brand new think tank at this event that is co-sponsored by the NATO Public Diplomacy Division. Alliance for Europe is an organization that wants to achieve a more democratic Europe through citizen engagement. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Sigma on how to develop new thought leadership on these key issues that are really shaping our time. We've seen disinformation throughout, the last decade, 5 years, 2 years. It's been on the rise, and right when we thought that it couldn't get any more urgent, this war in Ukraine and the situation there has shown us that there is an all-out information war that's really, wanting to shape our narrative. And we've seen that the Russian strategy on disinformation here has run up against a very clear information war strategy on the Ukrainian side. We're seeing new things happening now that we were not seeing even a couple of months ago. But it is very important for us to understand that we're seeing part of a whole. We're seeing one comprehensive problem, which is there are forces out there that are wanting to denigrate and destabilize and fragment our democracies. And we need to think what to do about it. And we need to shape a digital space nowadays that enables democracy, that is based on fundamental values of human rights, the rule of law, democracy, inclusion, and diversity, all of these pretty words that really actually mean something. And we're seeing people in Ukraine currently fighting for those words and for their lives. And all of this is interconnected. So without further ado, I will pass it on to our esteemed speakers and moderator to deliver this panel event to you. We will be publishing reports after this and hopefully taking this forward and engaging further, building out networks on disinformation that bring young people and bring new leadership to this issue with current decision makers. But I will let Adrian tell you all about that. So without further ado, Adrian, over to you. Thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you, Omri, for your opening words, for kicking us off here tonight. Our first Open Youth Outreach Conference. Very exciting to be here. I'm very happy to welcome you all, as well as people watching on the live stream. And I'd want to also thank Alliance for Europe for your partnership on this, for NATO PDD for co-sponsorship and making this possible, as well as the publication you will have all seen on the way in. I hope you've all grabbed your copies. If you haven't, ask. We have plenty and it's good reading. And of course, to our panelists. So we're going to give you guys your due and go through your incredible credentials. I have been advised to keep it very short because if I listed all your accomplishments, that would be the end of our time. And no one here wants to go straight to the reception, I'm sure. But first and foremost, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Chris Kremidas-Courtney, who is a senior fellow at the Friends of Europe, a lecturer for the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and a lecturer for the Institute of Security Governance in Monterey, California, as well as a lecturer for the Stratcom hybrid program at Universidad Rey Carlos in Madrid. Chris is also the gentleman who said that disinformation is the plastic waste of the information sphere, and that it lasts for hundreds of years and continues to pollute the atmosphere, which proves, if nothing else, that not only does disinformation stick around, but so do pithy quips. So that is at least a little bit of silver lining. I will not take up any more of your spotlight, Chris, so please, without any further ado, over to you for your keynote remarks.
Thank you so much, Evan. Thank you, Sigma, Alliance for Europe, NATO PDD, and to everyone joining us here tonight. It's my pleasure to be with you to open off with some remarks. My remarks are basically on sort of what we've seen in Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sort of the global whole of society response. So in past wars, people often felt powerless sitting at home, reading the newspapers or watching on television as the events unfolded far away. But as we're seeing now in this era of hyper-empowered citizens and private actors, they no longer must sit and watch. Now they can have a very real influence on events and possibly even help to shape outcomes. So having myself taught seminars and conducted exercises on whole of society responses for years, we've known for some time that governments and institutions no longer had a monopoly on shaping outcomes. But I could never imagine the breadth and depth of the global whole of society response that we're seeing right now in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This global whole of society response began even before the first Russian tank rolled through the border gates and has grown in its size and impact ever since this new phase of the invasion began 21 days ago. In our last Friends of Europe tabletop exercise, we came up with the concept of information first responders. And in late February, we already saw hundreds of citizens and civil society groups debunking Russian disinformation by looking at embedded geolocation and time data on videos or finding out they're just old footage from past conflicts elsewhere. They're taking these actions quickly and sharing them on social media where they're then shared beyond their own personal networks. Governments and media companies are also working to debunk disinformation, but these private and civil society actors have been much faster and more responsive. We're also looking at a bit of a crowdsourced open source war. We've seen the availability of photos on social media, TikTok videos, and quality overhead imagery from private firms like Maxar be put to use by former intelligence analysts with the training and experience to analyze information rapidly and turn them into reports to be used not only by Ukrainian authorities, but by journalists and citizens worldwide. I mean, we're seeing this on Twitter, we're seeing this on LinkedIn. I mean, I'm seeing it everywhere. And it's remarkable to me that the Wikipedia Ukraine situation map is on par with the situation maps being produced by advanced governments, military, and intelligence services at a much higher cost, millions of euros, right? There are even individuals in civil society groups that are already collecting and cataloging data on potential war crimes. But it's the Ukraine's IT army that's really gained the most attention, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But one whole society effort that's received the most attention, I think, is the hacktivist army that's assisting Ukraine in this war, drawing cyber experts and hackers from all over the world, even including inside of Russia. And the call from the Ukrainian digital ministry drew 170,000 volunteers in the first week, and there are now over 300,000 persons on the dark web and on the group's Telegram channel to coordinate attacks on Russian government websites and to interfere with Russia's ability to continue its attack on Ukraine. And the numbers are remarkable. While, of course, government actors remain active in the cyber war, the widespread use of proxies has also really proven to be a vulnerability for Russia, since many of their own proxies have changed sides in the last 3 weeks. They're like, no, I'm not supporting this, I'm out. And the thing with proxies is they switch sides once, they could always switch sides again. So this is something to keep an eye on. But some cyber activists have even been tracking in the early days, especially before the real this phase of the invasion. I always think remember it started in 2014. They were tracking Russian troop movements by the digital footprints they left by their soldiers as they downloaded or played music from popular music sharing platforms. Every time you download music, you leave a digital footprint of who you are and where you are. And they were tracking this. But it's the sheer size and technical capabilities of this volunteer cyber effort that I find astonishing. In the words of one hacktivist who's involved in the effort, this much cyber power is hard for any state to stand up against. So in addition, we're also seeing individuals donating to the Ukrainian military, companies donating equipment. There are also online activists seeking to reach the Russian people and tell them what is happening in their name. For example, a Norwegian computer expert created a website to enable anyone to send an email about the war in Ukraine to up to 150 Russian email addresses at a single time. And this effort right now is believed to be possibly reaching as many as 22 million Russian citizens by this weekend. It's an enormous number. It's enormous reach from private citizens. In other cases, they're posting similar messages in the online reviews of restaurants all over Russia. And I've seen a few of those. So while the kinetic war rages on in Ukraine, this global whole of society, I call it a swarm response. They're much like white blood cells in a body attacking a virus. They're going after anything connected to the Russian government's attack and their armed forces, their intelligence, and so on. And these actors are moving with great speed in just hours, while governments and institutions might need a few coordination meetings or even a whole day or two to respond. So there's a speed factor. And what's really important to point out is that the principle of whole society approaches is that there's no hierarchy. So this whole effort is non-hierarchical. It's happening because these individuals and civil society groups are motivated by a combination of moral outrage and moral obligation. And the moral leadership in this case is coming from Ukraine's president, Zelensky. And this is where the topic of, you probably wondered when I was get there, this is where the topic of disinformation comes in, because such moral motivations can be manipulated, potentially turning this swarm of private and civil society actors against our own institutions. We saw that on the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. We saw it in the attempted storming of the Bundestag in August of 2020. And we've even seen it in numerous attacks on vaccine centers in Europe during the pandemic, or even attacks on 5G towers and mobile towers. But the first disinformation danger for this whole society swarm, I think, could come, what we should expect to see will be information manipulations which are designed to degrade and strip away Ukraine and Zelensky's moral leadership, in much the same way that Russian disinformation actors went after the white helmets in Syria. In fact, I even heard, I was even hearing the white helmet accusations today from someone saying, oh, the white helmets are going to Ukraine. Oh, they're going to be doing bad things. So that's, again, plastic waste of the infosphere, disinformation. But I think we can also possibly expect to see the use of a deep fake, which could depict Zelensky agreeing to a peace deal or surrendering. And this is the sort of thing that would sow confusion among Ukraine's defenders at home and its helpers abroad. So these are just a few possibilities. But I think nonetheless, this new phenomenon of a highly effective global whole society swarm of hyper-empowered private and civil society actors, and the danger of them being manipulated in the future by disinformation, to me becomes all the more apparent when we consider the arrival of augmented reality, virtual reality, and AI-enabled infobots and their ability to influence societies. I also need to ask, in this emerging world in which almost every citizen will carry an electronic sword, so to speak, we need to ask ourselves, is it time for a Geneva Convention for the information sphere? Of course, there will be numerous legal and ethical challenges to such an accord, but as my dear friend Jessica Giandomenico said, just because this would be difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And finally, I think we need a similar global whole society response to help the millions of war refugees fleeing from Ukraine into the rest of Europe. We're already seeing good indications that this is occurring, but I think we need to ensure that the depth and intensity of our support for the refugees is just as strong and enduring as it has been for Ukraine's war effort. Again, thank you all so much again, and I really look forward to hearing tonight's panelists. Back to you, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Chris. You've raised some incredible points, everything from the flagship, from the capstone, the Geneva Convention for the information sphere, to the broad horizontal, the whole of society response, something that we here are extremely interested in. Of course, this is part of our mission, part of our function is Sigma, but we want to connect emerging leaders and youth with these discussions, and they are an integral part of society. So I think, at least from my perspective, it is impossible to understand whole of society without also answering the question for everyone here and everyone outside of this room as well. What is their role? What are their duties and obligations? What possibilities do they have? And also, what will carrying the torch forward into the next generation look like? And speaking of the next generation, this is, I know, not the topic of tonight, but you have raised some very interesting points about the next generation of conflict. And it was something that struck me. I know years back, disinformation, hybrid tactics, asymmetric actions were used as threshold tactics, things that were up to but not explicitly confrontational, but they were disruptive. And it is interesting to have witnessed the transformation of a threshold action into a widespread, almost grassroots, integral part of the foundations of a modern conflict. And then the question will be, what does this mean for conflicts of the future and how we recognize them, the signposting, and our responses and our preparedness for it? So I think we can dedicate, if not a whole day, a whole weekend, if not a whole year, to such a topic. But it's just something I think to bear in the back of our minds and to always consider how this plays out in the broader sphere. So thank you very much, Chris. And I'm sure you have plenty to continue adding and plenty for us to build on in tonight's conversation. So thank you again. Now, without any further ado, I will introduce formally the panelists that we have here, and Christina, who is joining us remotely. Christina, I will start with you up in the top right, nodding away. So Christina is a communication specialist at Eurothink, Center for European Strategies in Skopje, North Macedonia. She's also a fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy and George Mason University, and participates in the Young Faces 2022 program of cybersecurity and governance in the Western Balkans run by the DCAF. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Andrian, for the nice introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you one more time to the hosts, Sigma think tank and Alliance for Europe and NATO PDD for co-sponsoring this and giving us this opportunity to voice out why disinformation matters lately, and also good evening to the online attendees following this event. As Adrian mentioned, my name is Kristina Angilevska. I come from Skopje, North Macedonia, and I work as a communication specialist at Eurothink, Center for European Strategies, that is a local think tank organization based in Skopje, North Macedonia. As mentioned by the other speakers previously, disinformation, not just right now in 2022, but in the last couple of years, has been a challenging issue for the civil society sector and other relevant stakeholders. And I think it is of a crucial importance to tackle disinformation and debunk disinformation and misinformation, especially to a vulnerable target group such as youth, and in that way to significantly contribute towards democratic engagement, strengthening democratic values and exercising the rule of law. First of all, I would like to start off with naming out a couple of examples, actually efforts undertaken by the civil society, and what we have done with Eurothink, with my colleagues at Eurothink, in contributing to debunking disinformation through various project activities. First of all, I'd like to start off with something that has been recently implemented in a time span of 2 years. It's a project called Critical Thinking for Media-Wise Citizens that is directly sponsored by the European Union and implemented by Eurothink in collaboration with several others, non-governmental organizations in North Macedonia. The sole goal of this project was actually to support local civil society organizations in partnership with the media and other relevant stakeholders with the aim of promoting a culture of critical thinking by promoting media literacy. And I'd like to emphasize here what it has been done as a sustainability, as a communications development strategy after this project. Several organizations, including the organization Metamorphosis and the Foundation Friedrich Naumann, they have developed a most recent study and analysis of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it directly impacts young people and youth when it comes to disinformation, because they're the ones who are directly bombarded with different types of information being available online, not just through the COVID-19 pandemic, but we can see it right now with the war in Ukraine, with the Russian invasion. It's a bomb of information available to young people, and they're the ones who are directly exposed to this kind of narratives. Another very important activity that I'd like to bring it up here at this panel is another project that we're working on with Eurothink and my colleagues. It's an international project called Tackling Illiberal and Eurosceptic Narratives, which is implemented in partnership with several partner organizations from Italy, Slovenia, and Poland, and it's co-funded by the European Union through the Europe for Citizens program. What is striking, not just for me, but it was striking for my colleagues as well, as part of this project, is to see how people are directly influenced by disinformation, and due to their lack of information, they tend to develop illiberal narratives and Eurosceptic narratives about the European Union, the European people, and Europe as a whole. Most recently, myself and one of my colleagues, we presented the key findings of this project, findings based on focus group discussions with citizens in North Macedonia. And it was interesting to see that people tend to get confused with Europe as a continent and European Union as an institution. And they tend to develop Eurosceptic narratives and illiberal narratives about Europe and the institution, just due to the lack of information that they have. Like, for instance, they tend to confuse Europe as a continent with the European Union as an institution, and all those negative narratives that they hold, they think that those narratives belong to European identity, they belong to the European people, and they belong to Europe as a continent. And also, on another positive note, as part of this project, most recently, we held a public conference and a workshop with students, with youth as the most, I'd say, one more time, the most vulnerable target group being exposed directly to this kind of disinformation narratives. We did hold this conference and workshop about Eurosceptic narratives and how to move towards progressive narratives at one of the universities in North Macedonia, University of Tetovo. And I was thrilled myself to see that most of the students were more Euro-enthusiastic rather than Eurosceptic, regardless of the fact that they're immensely exposed to different types of disinformation narratives and illiberal narratives and non-democratic narratives. Yet, even though we're still in the waiting room of the EU accession and negotiation process, young people are still the ones, around 70% of them are still eager to move towards social progress, economic and political progress in the country. And I'd like to also emphasize what should be done in the future, like just to point out some recommendations of how we're supposed to tackle these narratives. I think a three-dimensional perspective is needed. Like, from a cross-cutting perspective, it is essentially important to include the civil society sector in tackling disinformation, academic institutions, the general public, and youth themselves in tackling this kind of narratives and disinformation narratives in general. Something that we're doing with Eurothink, something that it's in the process of being accomplished. It's a development of a youth center in the southwestern region of the country. Why am I emphasizing the southwestern region? Because it is the place where we have a variety of mixed groups, a variety of mixed ethnic groups, and just investing in youth, not just in trainings, let's say, about reconciliation, about post-conflict rehabilitation, but directly investing in strengthening their capacities, in strengthening their critical thinking skills, in strengthening their soft skills, through offering training about entrepreneurship, and through offering trainings about what is needed in the community. It is of pivotal importance to do this so that they get distracted of non-democratic narratives, so that they get distracted of radicalizing themselves towards disinformation narratives. And I think in this way, resilience will be built, and youth as a target group that is easily exposed to disinformation counter narratives will have their views broadened and will have their capacities significantly strengthened. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to fruitful discussions and looking forward to taking your questions at a later stage tonight. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Christina. You've raised a lot of very interesting points. I would love to come back to you as the conversation continues and talk about particularly vulnerabilities, what makes youth so vulnerable, and how that ties into building resilience as a theme, which is central to the conversation we're having here tonight. And also, I'd just like to note that a lot of the points you raised at the end there, de-radicalization, feature in the report that we had already published on the basis of our high-level working group, which took place last month. And this is a theme of radicalization, polarization, and how we deal with disinformation and its repercussions long-term. So absolutely something that I'd love to get into as well. Moving down the line, closer to me, Paula Redondo, you are program officer for Russia and Central Asia at NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. And prior to that, you worked as a policy advisor to the delegation of the European Union to the United States, covering human rights, migration, and multilateral issues. Welcome to the panel. I'm very happy to have you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, it works, right? Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. It's great to be here. And at NATO, I think it's something that has been raised by everyone. We really believe in the importance of building resilience to counter disinformation, and for that, educating the public and talking about the dangers of disinformation, I think is crucial for this. So thank you very much to Sigma for this opportunity. So first of all, I will talk a bit about the security environment and the threats that NATO is facing with regards to disinformation, and then I will briefly touch upon how NATO counters this issue. So disinformation is not new for NATO. It's not something that we are seeing now. It's not something that we started seeing in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. It's something that we have been facing since the beginning. Propaganda, disinformation, hostile activities from foreign entities, state and non-state actors. So what we have seen that while all methods have not disappeared and they are still there, what we are seeing is greater sophistication, scale of the disinformation operations due to the technological advances. I mean, you all know what I'm talking about, social media, but also online media, the fact that anyone can say anything and it's difficult to check where the information comes from. So hostile actors are very smart and they have learned that they can use this to attack our societies. And these considerations have become part of their strategic aim. So they use this information to really advance their geopolitical ambitions, as we are seeing very clearly with Russia now. So one of the things that they use the most, and I think this has already discussed by previous speakers, is the fact that they use public opinion to polarize. They use this disinformation to polarize public opinion. So they use our own weakness actually to attack them and exploit them in a way. And we can trust in institutions. We are democracies, and what they do is basically they saw this mistrust and they create this mistrust in the institutions that allows them to attack our institutions, rule of law, etc. And a very real concrete problem of all of that is that this disinformation that we see in the online space in many occasions actually creates real life action. So this is not only an online abstract thing that people are saying things on the internet. No, people react when you are seeing things on the internet. So we have seen many cases, for example, with when we had the refugee crisis in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, there were like a lot of misinformation about refugees. So they have like rape people and all of that. And then that also became in like further discrimination for refugees, for example, to name something. We also saw that in 2014 in Russia, where they were like propaganda about attacks against like Russian speakers, and that also made people demonstrate against that. So this information that we see in the online realm is also very dangerous. More recently, we have seen it with COVID. People do not believe in COVID because they read on the internet that is some sort of like created thing, and that makes them not believing in vaccines or in wearing masks, etc., etc. So there is a very real danger to disinformation and propaganda. And obviously, I cannot talk about disinformation without touching upon the ongoing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And paraphrasing many smart men that have said this before me, the truth is the first casualty of war. And we have seen this very clearly right now. Russia has played a very old playbook that I think they always do the same. They first started denying that they were doing a building up around Ukraine. They were saying like, no, this is actually NATO. It's NATO who is being aggressive. It's the allies that are putting all the weapons close to us. It's they that they are threatening us. So first they deny. Then right before the invasion, they started trying to create a false pretext. They created this humanitarian emergency. All of a sudden that was happening in the Donbass. Then they were talking about claims about genocide, completely bogus claims about genocide, completely bogus chains about mass graves. And then when they started the invasion based on these false pretenses, they started to fill their information space with all sorts of narratives, trying to portray Ukraine as the aggressor and Russia as the humanitarian actor that was just trying to keep the peace. And for us, I think these Russian narratives are very unsophisticated. We see that and it's like, this is impossible to believe. But if you mix this with the fact that Russia has completely eliminated free media inside the country, this really allows propaganda to disseminate and run, if you want to say like that, run completely unchecked. So in a way, this is why very quickly after the invasion, especially when Russia saw that their plans, the things were not going according to their plan, they moved very quickly to completely basically close access to Facebook and Instagram and slow down Twitter. And then they blocked access to a bunch of independent media websites, foreign and local. And they, probably you are aware, they also passed this law that I think impose up to 15 years of jail for anyone that does that, how they call it, disseminate false information, which is basically calling war a war. And they need to call it a special operation. You all know this. So the fact that they implemented all of that and they tried to really do war-like censorship in Russia means that it shows you the importance of this information, winning the war in the information space. Sorry, that's what I mean. And in this context, when you don't have free media, it's obviously very easy to understand how propaganda can disseminate not only within Russia, but this through the internet very easily. It can get to our societies also. Regarding NATO's approach to counter disinformation, so what do? We believe we have what we call a dual track approach that is understanding the information environment and engaging proactively to counter this disinformation. So to understand the information engagement, what we do, we track, we monitor, and we analyze. We talk with allies, we engage with partners, with other international organizations to really understand what's going on. And then more importantly, we need to be proactive about communication. Debunking is very important, but I think it's even more important to be there before and put your information ahead. And as part of this engagement, one of the crucial parts of it is actually building societal resilience, which is what I talked briefly before about teaching the public media literacy, for example, teaching them how to find so they can read everything. They can read Russia Today, well, now no, because it's banned, but they could read Russia Today, but at least they know what they are reading and they know that that's not a trustable source. So they can have information to sources, and they also can distinguish between sources that they can trust and sources that they cannot trust. So we continue to, of course, expose this information and work with partners for all of that. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much. You raised a lot of really fascinating points, as have the speakers so far. But what really stood out is something to bear in mind, that disinformation is not new, and that this is something that has been emerging over the course of years. It's been tied to societal change, but also technological change. So ends have changed, means have changed. That's something to bear in mind, and not get distracted by the very shiny conflagration which is in front of us, because this is going to transcend whatever current crisis is going on, be it the Russian invasion of Ukraine or future conflicts as well. And also, I think it's something interesting to come back to perhaps is the relationship between disinformation and propaganda that you raised as well, or if I could put it another way, disinformation aimed internally at one's own people, and in particular what the relationship is with diluting or trying to combat disinformation in the media sphere or in the information sphere when there is no free media, or when the actors doing the disinforming have control over all the channels. So how do we work around that? How do we overcome that? How do we push through that? Last but not least of our esteemed panelists, Nadia Kolasikovna, Senior Analyst in charge of Transnational Security Portfolio at the EU ISS, EU Institute for Security Studies. In particular, you focus on hybrid threats, resilience, interference, disinformation, democracy, election security, and transatlantic cooperation. I do not know how you keep all of that straight, but we're very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me as well tonight. It's my pleasure to be actually in this group for the second time, as I took part in the roundtable in February. And I think also my role today will be kind of to remind us of the key takeaways from the roundtable, what actually has been published also in the report and what has not. been published perhaps in the report, and where we can go from there. So today to discuss further and also contribute to the thinking together on this issue. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Nadia Kolasikovna. I'm the senior analyst at the EU ISS, which is an autonomous agency of the EU under the External Action Service. And I am in charge of the transnational security. And you heard all those parts of the portfolio that I do try to cover. So perhaps just a brief summary of the key takeaways from the discussion we had, and that you maybe have already read in the report, maybe not yet. But just to summarize where we agreed and where we think we need to work more towards being more effective in discussing, but also countering the disinformation efforts or information manipulation. That is the terminology that we are using more frequently at the EU level. So what we discussed is that there are multiple ways of addressing, perhaps too many ways of addressing disinformation, which may lead to, of course, perhaps touching also the right points, but at the same time, maybe not streamlining our efforts properly, considering the whole of society approach. We have different actors, either the aggressors, but also the actors that are trying to address and counter disinformation efforts. So we do have the multitude of the efforts, multitude of the actors, and also multitude of the tools and tactics that do continue to evolve. As Paula very rightly mentioned, this is absolutely not a new phenomenon. It's perhaps discussed in different lenses. The scope has changed, the speed has changed, the actors have been growing. But also the target audiences have been more vulnerable in some ways, considering that we have the technological advancement that does help amplify the spread of the manipulated information. So we did discuss all of that. What was, I think, interesting is that we do have also a lot of new frameworks. We have the External Action Plan to counter disinformation since December 2018. We also have the increased efforts on the EU front with the Code of Practice on countering disinformation in cooperation with the social media companies, the signatories of the Code of Practice, which is a self-regulatory tool. We also have different efforts to counter information manipulation as part of the wider toolkit of the hybrid threats, of the interference. We have centers of excellence on strategic communication in Riga, on hybrid threats in Helsinki, in Finland. We, of course, have hybrid fusion cell at the intelligence unit at the EU level. So we do have a lot of new mechanisms, groups, task forces to counter it. The question is, to what extent we are actually effective and impactful and succeed in comparison to these efforts by the so-called malign actors, which is perhaps the terminology we can use in this sense. So we have agreed that we have achieved some progress. Of course, we have achieved some progress. These efforts have not been in the void, but there are new ways to also still approach it. For example, what is a bit of a lacking is gender perspective. So one of the most targeted groups, most vulnerable groups, which are exposed to these disinformation efforts is, for example, different marginalized groups, women that have been disproportionately targeted during election times, minorities, and of course, then you can look at the youth, at the older generation, and different groups that have been actually very much victims of these efforts. So through this gender perspective that has been mentioned also in our discussion, there is an increase in understanding vis-a-vis the impacts on different segments of the society that is also needed to be explored further. Second, there is usually in the discussions the elephant in the room, which are the social media platforms. So many times we do discuss about how much the platforms have been doing to counter disinformation or may not have been doing, but there is perhaps less of an action on raising this accountability and the transparency of their efforts, as sometimes the discussion is around, are they editors, the social media platforms, are they media, are they businesses, what are the responsibilities? So this more of perhaps bold discussions many times are still lacking in the conversations, and perhaps with the new Digital Services Act at the EU level or the European Democracy Action Plan, there is going to be perhaps more discussion, also the data privacy regulations, etc. So when I'm talking about the regulation now, of course, another big topic we discussed at the roundtable was legislation. Can we legislate on countering disinformation? If so, are we infringing upon the freedom of speech? Well, then we kind of continue this discussion. Well, freedom of speech does not equal freedom of reach. So is this freedom of reach leading us to the fact, should we focus on the content or should we focus on the behavior? If we continue speaking about perhaps disinformation, unless we really touch upon the intent and the tools that are being used to amplify it, we do get stuck sometimes in the conversation about focusing on the false information, so-called fake news, or just misleading information overall. While if you look at the information manipulation terminology that we have been more exploring in this field, there is more focus on the behavior. How do we address the amplification, the algorithms that are being used, the tools that are being used for also speaking and targeting different audiences through visuals, podcasts, radios, of course, all kinds of deep fakes, as was mentioned earlier, that is probably going to be further explored in the future as we are moving somehow from the written word to all kinds of ways of expressing and sharing information. And then perhaps not the lastly, but almost lastly, the whole of society approach. What does that mean? We do agree that there are different actors that spread disinformation, that are actors that are playing a role and those that are targeted, but we sometimes do not include them in the conversations enough. We many times discuss either between the policymakers or we include some academics, think tankers, but for perhaps sometimes the private sector is not there, academics are not there, journalists that play extremely important role are not there, or the different types of groups like youth. Like perhaps that's one of the added value of tonight as well, and of these efforts to see how to engage further the youth, but also we need to see how to engage further the older generations, because this actually research has shown that is mostly, I mean, so far, it also depends on the topics, that it has been also the older generation, above 50 or 60, depending on the research that you read, spreading disinformation or manipulated information. So how do we enhance these efforts to maybe have more intergenerational media literacy or digital literacy efforts? How do you speak to those people that are not in the schools anymore, outside of the educational system, when we speak about addressing these threats through the educational system? How do they find the time? How do you make them understand that they do need to address this, and actually that there is a problem? First, to recognize that there is a problem and they have been targeted or they have been part of this kind of chain of the disinformation campaigns. So that's a challenge that remains. There is less focus on that. So perhaps I would say one of my recommendations to the youth that I will share tonight would be to also think of the other generations, to not only about yourself, how to build your own resilience and understand these issues, but help others to build their resilience. Help your parents, help your grandparents, your aunts and aunts. And sometimes perhaps it seems like this is the very personal, individualized approach, but at the moment we do not have many other tools to address those generational gaps. So we need to start somewhere. And maybe just what I would love to see in the maybe next editions of the reports, when we speak about the information manipulation or countering disinformation, we do focus on the content that we are seeing spread, but we less focus on the suppressed content, what is not in the public spheres, what we are not seeing there. And why are we not seeing there? And how does that influence our thinking and undermines the perhaps understanding of the issues and makes us vote differently, makes us support the war instead of fighting it? So what is it about the vacuum of information, the lack of access, but also understanding that there is purposefully, intentionally suppression of information. And this is an important part of the information manipulation that many times it's missing because we do focus so much on the content. That's why focusing on the behavior may be a better way forward at this point. Also, I think we have all heard a lot, especially since the illegal annexation of Crimea since 2014, about the foreign actors. But there are a lot of internal domestic actors as well that are either used as proxies or we could debate further. So also understanding that this is a wider ecosystem, and we need to make sure that we are not forgetting the importance of countering the problem as such, and not the actors necessarily only. Also, perhaps the last point, and it was also one of my first points, was that information manipulation or disinformation is only part of the wider toolkit of interference. What are the other tools of interference, for example, that are many times used in parallel at the same time are cyber attacks, cyber operations, or malign finance, financing of the political campaigns of certain actors. We have seen this happening during Brexit, for example, in the US elections and many others. Also economic coercion, when there is the abuse or exploitation of the existing dependencies that are many times, we have seen it also during the current crisis, the fact that there is such a high level of energy dependence has played very well through different topics of the Nord Stream 2 or others into the narratives manipulated by the malign actors. And perhaps lastly, also making sure that we really build up the resilience and the robust efforts of the independent journalists, of the civil society, because they can also otherwise their efforts can be undermined or exploited in with the intention to really undermine the democratic values. And all of this, I think, is important, and the biggest perhaps strength that we as democracies and democratic institutions and organizations of NATO and EU and democratic countries have, that all of these efforts need to keep in mind the key principles and values that are democratic values. So we do have to make sure that we do preserve the freedom of speech, not necessarily the freedom of reach, that we do preserve the freedom of expression and the gathering and the human rights and the transparent, the right to correct and factual information, etc., etc. So I think that really distinguishes us from more of those autocratic, authoritarian efforts that are trying to undermine those values ultimately, and therefore divide and polarize and exacerbate the divisions between citizens, institutions, governments, and the countries themselves. I'll just leave it here. I do hope that it does inspire some questions, and I am looking forward to the discussion as my co-panelist. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, I would like to make it very clear that we want to reserve a lot of time for questions from everyone here in the room, but also we already have some questions rolling in online from the live stream. So that'll be coming back. Rather than respond to you directly, I'd actually like to put Christina on the spot and ask her if she would like to respond in particular to the point that Nadia raised about gender perspectives, and then also bridging into the question of building resilience. I know this is something that you had wanted to speak to as well. So please roll with it.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you very much, Nadia, for being very detailed in your presentation. And this, what you had brought up about the gender perspective and including the older generation in tackling disinformation pretty much inspired me, just like Adrian said, to emphasize what I had initially wanted to emphasize in my presentation as well. I think, as Adrian mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, I'm a participant in a cybersecurity governance school implemented by DCAP, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. And that one is, it is cybersecurity governance school based on online workshops and webinars about how to build cyber resilience and how to tackle also disinformation nowadays. And I think women in particular are very much exposed to disinformation narratives from the perspective of being discriminated and exposed to stereotypes and prejudices just because they work in institutions, particularly male-dominant institutions. Like most recently, there was a situation in North Macedonia with the current Minister of Defense, Ms. Slavianka Petrovska. She was very much criticized and very much exposed to hate speech online just because she is a woman, and she was considered not a good fit for that position, a position that supposedly should be held by a male. And I was wondering, and I'm thinking that those kind of narratives are built by people in the community, and it's not just youth that they're exposed to that, but this comes also from the older generations, the generation that should be really educated about this very new narratives, if we want to strengthen democracy, and if we want to exercise democratic rule of law, we also have to make sure that this older generation in particular bears in mind that there aren't anymore typically male-dominant industries, as people were used to that, let's say, years ago in the early 90s or during the time of Yugoslavia. It's very different right now, and women also should be the ones to be given the voice and the chance to be part of this kind of participatory and decision making processes. So thank you very much, Adrian, for giving me the chance to emphasize this very important issue nowadays.
No, thank you. And I'd like to actually continue on with the theme of going back and forth with some questions. I'd like to share a few that we've already fielded here. I'm going to ask them specifically to some of the panelists, but I hope that everyone feels free to jump in. Either grab your mic and go for it, or make eyebrows at me and I'll make sure to call on you, so no problem. The first question that we have is from the live stream, and this is on the idea for the Geneva Convention for the information sphere. So this is open to anyone who would like to take it. I don't think I see Chris in the room, or he is. Okay, great. In which case, yes. Hello, Chris. That first one will be for you, and then I would open it to the panel for everyone. And to put it on everyone's minds already, the second question regards youth and building resilience and producing a positive narrative. So what we can do to help build that positive narrative for youth in particular, and how that feeds into the whole of society approach as well. Chris, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers for your interventions already. I mean, I've been doing this business for a long time, and it's just so great to see how dialed in you all are on all these issues and how involved. And I think, so getting to the question of a Geneva Convention for the information sphere, you know, the sphere of the Geneva Convention on Warfare was agreed among states. And, you know, it was the realm of state actors. And this was, of course, you know, during a long period of time when states had the monopoly on the use of force. And, you know, it gets into, I mean, it's the idea is, it may not be achievable for a long time, but I think, first of all, you have to make the, you know, I'm not a lawyer myself, but I've been talking to lawyers about this one. You have to make the jump from use of force to use of electronic means as being equal to the use of force. You can damage countries, you can damage health systems, you can do a lot of damage with cyber means and information means. So you can have as much impact as, you know, a cannon from 100 years ago. So what does that mean? So, you know, we have to redefine some of those things legally and agree to that. That takes a while. And then, you know, primarily we're looking at non-state actors, right? Because, you know, states do not have a monopoly on the use of cyberspace or the ability to use cyberspace maliciously or for positive reasons. Private individuals and so on have the ability to do that. And this is the thing is, you know, we get into the discussion of what does state power mean in 2022, 2023, 2024, with the rise of these new technologies, with the ability of hyper, I call them hyper, it used to be super empowered citizens, now they're hyper empowered. They have the tools, they have the technology, they know how to use it. And in many cases, they're you know, a year or two ahead of government regulation, which is always slow to catch up. And so I think it's worth pursuing. I think it's worth looking at because of the impact that these things can have. Now, obviously, you get into issues of you know, legal status of what does force mean, what does the cyber force mean. You get into, you know, questions of democracy. You know, what would that even look like to hold people accountable? You know, for that. I did a study a little over a year ago. I started a study on possible legal remedies for the use of disinformation to cause harm. And the only laws I could find anywhere in Europe that really had any teeth were related to hate speech. And so, you know, you couldn't really make the legal jump to hate speech. And I think around the time of the French election of 2017, they passed some law that was very specific to that presidential election. But I think that's the thing is we don't even have the internal legal framework to deal with this, but I think it's worth sort of throwing it out there as something to look at and pursue. How do we define that? Because right now, people have that ability to reach out and influence, to reach out and do harm, do good, all of the above. So I throw it out there as an idea, as something, something that perhaps this generation can tackle. But it's going to take a lot of work. And I hope there's some lawyers in the room. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'd actually pass it over to anyone in the panel who wants to jump on this, either on this or on the follow-up question, which was on building a positive narrative. I see you making with Nadia.
Perhaps just briefly on that one, and we can move forward. I think a lot has been said. And so how do we do that? I think that's always a question. And NATO has been doing it, EU has been doing it. More can be done, perhaps, to fill those vacuums, be more proactive in this. I will put a concrete example. For example, in the Western Balkans, one of the narratives that is being used in the Western Balkans to divide the society there between different countries or within the countries there is to keep highlighting the divisiveness, the differences between different groups of those societies. So how do you build proactive narrative, for example, from the EU side? And I just recently published it in one of the foresight scenarios that just came out in January, was to actually focus on the unity. Still speak proactively about what unifies the society there, how the EU cares, how they have European perspective, what is the alternative to this division, to perhaps the Russian relationships and the bonds. So if we do know that one of the most divisive narratives is actually narrative about disunity, perhaps proactively we can have our narrative about the unity. So even just sometimes as simple as trying to counter the falsehood or those polarizing narratives is actually to focus on the uniting narratives. Just one example, and there are many more. Thank you.
Just very briefly to add, I completely agree with what you say. And I think it's also very important to get ahead of the message. If you also know what the other side would do, just you say it first, because that's very, it's very simple, but it works very well. And I think we have seen it play out a bit in the leading up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where like the US intelligence services and NATO allies have been like calling out Russia, saying, no, that's a lie. We know what you're planning to do. You're planning to do this. And Russia was forced to be on the defensive on many of those issues. And that's why they were also not able to build a proper pretext for the invasion, and it was like just a bunch of things here and there and hoping like something sticks. So I think it's also very important to, of course, know what your opponent is going to say and deny it, and also get ahead of the message first.
Otherwise, I see a hand from Christina. Please feel free to jump in, and then Nadia, if you had something that you wanted to add.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. I just wanted to add briefly on what Nadia was saying about the Western Balkans and the divisiveness. Indeed, I couldn't agree more as someone that lives in the Western Balkans, particularly as a citizen in North Macedonia. I completely agree with what you said. That is the narrative. Let's focus on the divisiveness rather than the unity. But the question here also would be, how do we establish shared futures rather than divisive narratives? How do we tackle this divisiveness, and how do we reach shared features? And here you just inspired me to share what my team at Eurothink, what they have completed most recently, a report that was completed based on radicalization and polarization, mainly in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in North Macedonia. And the key findings were striking. Indeed, I can share with all of you, I can share the report in the chat, but just to come back to what Adrian asked me at the beginning of the panel, what is very much connected to radicalization and polarities, I'd say that this divisiveness in the Western Balkans comes pretty much from the polarized communities in WB6, and that polarization greatly comes from the different personal and social identities that people hold, that youth hold. in the communities, like the way they interact within their own intragroups, compared to the way how they react and communicate with other intergroups. That is, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different social backgrounds, which adds to the divisiveness, I would say, in the community. Sometimes people are very much, not just sometimes, I'd say always, the key factors influencing this divisiveness would be the education system, would be the families themselves, the way people are raised to perceive the others in the community. And just very shortly about the report, the very key point of this report is how do we establish positive radicalization, which very much draws upon the energy of civic participation to propel social progress. The name of the report is Sell Out, Tune Out, Get Out, or Freak Out. I don't want to take much of the time of other speakers and the audience. I will just share the report in the chat so that you can take a look at it and take a look at it in more details to see what it is about. Thank you.
And get the word out. Chris, I see you have a hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll just very quickly, I neglected to mention this in my talk earlier, so forgive me, but the entire whole of society effort beyond, both within the information sphere and beyond it, is youth-led. It is, if it were not for people under the age of 35 who have the knowledge and the willingness and the motivation to take these actions, it wouldn't be happening. You know, it wouldn't be. If it was a bunch of people my age, it wouldn't be happening. Just forget it. So that's the one thing I think, is that youth are leading. The youth of the world, the youth of Europe are leading this effort now. And I think that's, I think there's an important sort of generational gap. I'm having to spend a lot of time explaining to people who are in very senior positions what this means and what they're doing, because they just don't understand it. So I think to one of the earlier speakers said, really appreciated what she said, that, tell your parents, tell your bosses, educate them, because I think that's a huge role for everyone in this room. And I know you probably do that already every day, but I can't emphasize that enough. This entire global whole of response effort that's happening is led by young people.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very glad to hear it, actually. It's rather empowering and it's good to know, but no pressure. We have a question as well from the live stream. And then actually, we also have a microphone in the back. I'd like to pass around and take some questions from the audience here, if that's all right with our panelists as well. So the question that we have from online is, who should be the ones to communicate a positive public narrative? State actors, civil society, political institutions, who should do what for maximum impact, and by extension, who is coordinating such actions? This is for anyone to jump in. All of the above. Would anyone like to speak to any of them in particular? Nadia?
I can kickstart. I'm not sure if we need to coordinate all of those somehow. I think we also have the benefit of the plurality that needs to be there, of these self efforts of those actors that you already mentioned. All of them, I would say all of them need to be speaking out, especially if they're sharing information and opinions that are verifiable and factual and informed and do contribute to the debate meaningfully. Of course, I think at the state or international level, the coordination is important. We have heard about that, the streamlining of the efforts, perhaps adopting similar methodologies of assessment. So we are actually comparing comparable things. Also, of course, in the sense of the budgets, these are public budgets, so we need to make sure that it's effective and targeted efforts, prioritized in a way. But I actually think that even the previous question was so interesting, Adrian, that I still wanted to touch base on that. One of the ways to do that even would be the transparency, I would say, because it touches upon what Paula, you mentioned about getting ahead of those narratives. If you already know, and we do know many of those narratives already, of course, there is creativity that is sky is the limit. So there are always new ones as well, but there are also many those that repeat. Is the transparency, and that by the transparency and touching and connecting this point, I mean, if something is wrong, there has been mistake in a way, or there are regrets, or there is an issue with I don't know, deliveries of the vaccines or anything, this will be surely exploited, even though we don't have an experience with that, but we can expect that. So getting ahead or being transparent about informing the citizens about that is added value. It's not like, oh my God, we messed up, we have to hide it. No, on the contrary, the opposite. Be transparent about it. Tell people the truth. They are actually smart enough to appreciate the transparency and the accountability, the ownership you take of that if you do it the right way. And if you do it in the right time, if you do it in a way that you actually show that you are acting on those things, that you are not disregarding the negative impact. And also the second point, we can have as good proactive communication as we want, but we also have to have good policies. Yeah, we can speak about how much we do, but we also have to do those things. A lot of the issues are many times that we do have some ideas and we have some action plans, but the implementation of those is kind of sometimes lacking. So we do have to maybe catch up with the good policies, and then the good proactive communication will go easier as well, building this trust based on the record, not only based on the words. And I think this may sound very common sense, but we do have a lot of work, I think, to do to implement all those great ideas and the measures that have been already adopted, while perhaps also thinking of the new ones that could be more effective. And Christina, I'm very much looking forward to your reports. So hopefully leading by example and not freaking out in this hard situation sounds intriguing. Thanks.
If I may add something very quickly on the international cooperation, I just want to agree with Nadia saying that at the international level, I believe that we need to coordinate, and we do coordinate. NATO is coordinated on the disinformation sphere very closely with the EES, with the European Commission, but also with the UN, with some of the agencies of the UN that work on these issues, with the G7. So there is a lot of coordination on this information, because I think everyone understood, especially since 2014, the importance of all of this. And I think we have learned a lot of lessons from that.
Thank you, Paula. Christina, I saw that you had a hand up and then have lowered it.
Yeah.
We'll honor the hand.
Okay, thank you. Just very briefly to add again on what Nadia said, and just to add on the question you asked, Adrian, how do we build this kind of positive narratives? I fully agree as well. All of the above mentioned, civil society, media, general public, and relevant institutions should be the ones in charge and work together as a whole of society approach to deliver this kind of positive narratives. But in certain situations, I think that the government institutions are the ones who have the final say. And in having that final say, oftentimes they do not include the civil society, the media, that they're supposed to transfer that information to the general public. They do not include these parties, these entities on time. Like, for instance, most recently, a cybersecurity strategy has been developed in North Macedonia, and there is a working group about the process of implementation of that cybersecurity strategy. And how do the institutions, especially the Ministry of Interior Affairs, how does the ministry tackle actually disinformation, and how do they debunk disinformation? But in the working groups that monitor the progress of the cybersecurity strategy, it's the working group in itself is just consistent of 3 ministries, including the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Informatics and Technology, and the Ministry of Defense. But in those working groups, there's the civil society is still not included yet. The media, representatives of the media, journalists, are not part of those working groups, and oftentimes they're invited at the final stages, something that has been already concluded. So emphasizing one of the key pillars of democracy, transparency, especially in developing this kind of positive and progressive counter narratives, is of a pivotal importance, especially in a society like North Macedonia, which is a post-conflict community and a country in the process of development. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Let's jump over to the other Zoom window. Chris, you have a hand up, and then very briefly, we'll jump over to the audience and we'll take some questions directly from the people here in person. Chris?
Thank you. And just thank you for that, Christina. I think the really important thing about, and you're right, that's how it usually happens. That governments will, the ministry, you're lucky if you can get more than a few ministries together, right? That's a chunk of a challenge to match calendars and get them together. And then to bring in private citizens, academia, and so on. It's extremely difficult. But no matter what, civil society, private citizens, they're going to speak anyway. They're going to have their opinions. They will have a say regardless of whether we include them or not. And so that's why it's so important. I think even in the moment, if you can't work with them, it's so important to find ways to do that. So like for Friends of Europe, one thing we do is an annual tabletop exercise where we have NATO, EU, member states, private sector, civil society, media, big diverse group, and we put them through a simulated scenario and kind of look at how would they, what relationships and what working mechanisms do you wish you had so we could do these things. And it's tough going, but that's the thing is even getting a government, whole of government is hard, whole of society much harder. But again, there's no hierarchy in whole society. The government can sort of lead morally and with the messaging, but private citizens and civil society, they're going to say what they want. So if you include them, they're probably going to say something that matches a little better. But if you don't, who knows what kind of message they'll have. So I'll just leave it at that. But thank you, Christine. It's having done it, it's really difficult.
At this moment, I would like to ask anyone who wants to ask a question from the audience, please put your hand up. The microphone will visit you, and then our esteemed panelists here will tackle your questions head on in here in the middle.
Thank you. I'll start. There we go. I'll start because I know it's always awkward for the first person. I wanted to ask Nadia, because one point that you raised seemed very interesting to me, and it was the suppressed content. And just thinking about that idea, first thing that came to my head was the fact that I have never seen a disinformation web where you had to pay for access. Yet I see majority of the good independent journalism with paywalls. And the same applies to the fact that I'm no longer a student. And when I want to read academic articles, they are no longer accessible to me. And I just wonder whether maybe people could elaborate. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot by the fact that we are putting the independence on a pedestal and really not wanting to fund these providers of public good, in a sense, and we literally leave them off to live from subscription fees and ads revenue? What do you think about that?
I mean, usually you say, what a good question, but it is actually a really good question. And the suppression of information could go other ways too. So this is one way to look at it. It's a fair point. I think one of the issues is that because of abundance of information, so on one hand, sometimes we have lack of access to verifiable, actual, factual information. Also with the infodemic during the COVID-19, we have seen the abundance of information when it got difficult for people to filter the information that was relevant in the relevant time. Yes, with regards to the independent journalism or the quality journalism, it is becoming also thanks or because of the increased sources of information more difficult to sustain, because there is so much more information that people can just find for free. And it does take money to do the proper longer term research. It's their jobs. Many times they're independent journalists, freelancers, working from the field, etc. So I think the way perhaps to approach it is not to necessarily not fund it, but perhaps fund it more in a way. So there is perhaps maybe less need to have it paid by the readers, and they do have sufficient amounts from some independent autonomous grants or the ways to reach money and funding for their work that is costing and needs to be paid by someone. So the perhaps question is, who should pay? Right, in a way, and one of the recommendations, for example, in the European Democracy Action Plan as well, is to enhance the funding and the support to independent journalism, to the quality journalism. We have also seen that a lot of these journalists have been either threatened or even killed. So also the protection of those, the physical protection or even the cyber protection, because it's no longer the real and non-real world. It's more of the question of the physical world and more digital world, which are both very real by now. And there are all kinds of impacts based on their personal security, but also the mental health, the discouragement of participation, etc.
Paula?
If I may add something very quickly, personally, I've always been a big supporter of paid journalists. I believe like good journalistic work needs to be paid. As Nadia said, there is a lot of hours that go into that. Nadia raised a good point. Who should pay? Maybe we should fund it more. But like this, what you were raising about like websites that are for free and websites that are not, I put it like I compare it to, for example, if you buy a book in a shop, in a specialized shop, and you know this good, and or your neighbor tells you something. I mean, yeah, the opinion of your neighbor is for free, but is for free for a reason, no? Because maybe it's worthless in that way. So I think a way to, not always, there are probably neighbors that are very, very knowledgeable, but in a way, maybe it's a way to differentiate what is good, its source, and what is not. The fact that you have to pay for something and the fact that the other thing is free. So I think it's also, we need to be educated that information is not free. It wasn't for free until very recently, until the internet came along and all these media outlets started putting websites. You had to pay to buy a newspaper. So why now it needs to be for free? I think we got used to something that maybe shouldn't have been. And as far as I know, like a lot of like good media outlets, this is my personal opinion, had nothing to do with NATO, but good media outlets, they are actually making a lot of money in subscriptions because people are starting to value, like the New York Times or others, they're really starting to value this type of journalists. But I also agree with the fact that there is sometimes a lot of information. And one last point, your question is also very interesting because I think a lot of media realized that that was the case and they waive their fees, their subscription fees for certain topics, like for example now to follow the war in Ukraine or to follow the pandemic. A lot of medias that are usually under subscription, they waive the fees for that. So just wanted to say that.
Yes, we have another question here. Mic is being passed forward.
Thank you. I hope you hear my voice. My name is Joseph. I work for Forbes Georgia, and I have a question about social media and the mechanisms, what they can basically implement to control this information, abundance of information on social media available today, because this information. I think it was, I'm sorry. My name is Joseph from Forbes, Georgia. I have a question about social media and the mechanisms which they can employ actually to show people and readers whether the information is correct, whether it's disinformation. What do you think, whether is it really against freedom of speech, or we just could implement some soft methods to just show people whether this information is recommended by fact checkers or not? And whether it is possible to make some platforms of fact checkers internationally who could work with these social media platforms to just make this kind of inform-based analysis, because I've been working as a fact checker in the past, and I think that this research takes a lot of time. By the time when we produce this research, a lot of people already have read that information, and it's the disinformation basically spread out. So another question is mainly what are your ideas about implementing something very fast-tracked, which could definitely go against disinformation in a faster manner? Thank you.
This is open for anyone, but Christina, if I may, I'd like to call on you in particular, just because you raised quite a number of projects that you're working on very hands-on. I was wondering if any of those might be a starting point to answer this.
Yes, thank you very much, Adrian. So the question, as far as I could hear it well, it was about the impact of social media, right? And disinformation. Correct me if I'm wrong.
The mechanisms that social media can implement on the social media itself to inform the readers about the correctness of the information.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a wonderful question for one of the projects I mentioned, tackling illiberal and Eurosceptic narratives, that is implemented with other international partners, as I mentioned, from Italy, Poland, and Slovenia. And it's interesting to notice that even though people are exposed in abundance on social media, especially lately with the situation in Ukraine and the Russian invasion, there is disinformation present on the internet and the social media very much in abundance about what exactly is going on, who are the key actors in charge, what is the perception of youth in regards to the European Union, not just Europe, but the European Union in itself, the United States and NATO. And I'd like to emphasize one more time here that even though this elder generation tends to contribute towards this type of disinformation on the internet and build some Eurosceptic narratives about the European democratization processes, yet young people as the direct target group very much exposed to this disinformation narratives, they still tend to focus on being Euro enthusiastic rather than being Eurosceptic, just because they know that European values and European identity pretty much means being democratically involved in democratic engagements and strengthening the rule of law, strengthening democracy, but also at the same time, I think, and I'd like to go back to what Nadia said, let's educate this older generation. Let's start debunking disinformation from this older generation that have been exposed to conflicts and wars and various types of challenging situations, let's say in particular in the Western Balkans, and move towards a modern era of democracy and exercising proper rule of law. So that would be my answer to the question. Hope that clarifies things.
Thank you. Nadia, did you wanted to pitch in, please?
Yes, just to add as well, what has been already done. So especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and the infodemic, social media companies actually took more active role on addressing the amplification or exposing the false information that they could actually verify or not. So just like a few things that have been done was that some state-led media accounts have been actually identified as such. So if you would not know, let's say the RT or Sputnik or others are actually state-led media accounts, there would be a notification about that or a label, so this labeling. Or if a message has been disproportionately or proportionately much more spread than any other thing, and we are talking about thousands of the retweets or spreads on Facebook, etc. This would be also noted. It's like alert message in a way. This message has been much more spread than any other message in the last 24 hours, or this kind of, to give you an idea that this is perhaps amplified by bots, or it's more inauthentic amplification rather than organic spread. Also, what some of the social media companies started to do with the articles was to put links to other articles, previous articles, to provide context. So contextualize the information, because this is much the problem usually, that there is this independent ad hoc information and people then have difficulties to connect the dots. So this contextualization also has been more established. And perhaps also one last thing that I do know was done was that if some information would not have any other factual source that could be trackable, then there would be information this could not be verified, just as an alert for the readers. That so a few of these things I do think actually are useful and have been done, just to recognize also that there has been some progress on this front. Of course, to what extent this is actually institutionalized or this is regular, and do we also miss some of them, and is it done equally to all the sources, etc.? That's another question. But we do have at least some mechanisms already in place that could be perhaps enhanced.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start wrapping this up. We have very few minutes left, and we have a very nice reception here for the audience and for our panelists. So rather than sort of go down the line and do some closing remarks, I'd like to share a few last questions that we have from online, so we can leave with some thoughts and hopefully with some questions answered. The first I'll direct towards you, Paula, which is about EU-NATO cooperation in the field of disinformation. From your experience, very briefly, what has been accomplished and what still needs to be done? I know a lot to ask in a very short window, but we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Very briefly, and perhaps even Nadia knows more about this than me, even I'm the official voice on this. But I think there is the number one thing would be sharing information. I think we share a lot of information that maybe we were not sharing before. We are in constant touch, and I know this sounds like nothing, like, oh, you're in contact, yes, what? But that is actually very important. The fact that we are talking to each other instead of each of us doing our own thing on our own lane is already very, very important. And I think that brings obviously to a lot of coordination how to tackle many of these issues coming from disinformation, because the actors that let's say how do you say, not attack, but like that carry out hostile information activities against NATO, they are in many ways the same actors that carry against hostile information activities against the EU government and non-government actors. So I think the fact that we are sharing information and we are coordinating and we are talking is the most important. Of course, the EU has a legislative power that we don't have in NATO, and they are able to bring it forward. But I think the fact that we are coordinating and cooperating is very, very important.
Nadia, for your closing remark, if you had one thing off your wish list, what would there still be to do?
I have so many wishes.
That's why I said one.
I would say, of course, these partnerships, I think, are critical. Partnerships, NATO, EU, but also the question someone raised with the civil society and other actors. Maybe I'll just leave it there, the alliances and the partnerships. I think there is much more to be done with social media companies, etc. But I will want to leave it on. The partnerships are key because we, as democracies, I think are much stronger together. I mean, there are a lot of slogans, but they are more than that. And we are countering rising extremism. We are countering rising authoritarianism. We are also seeing humanitarian and experiencing humanitarian crisis. And all of this is where the democracies actually should play a role. And I do think that if we will find more mechanisms and engagements and lessons learned from each other that we will be able to implement in a democratic way. I think this is my wish list, to really protect those democratic values, implement them, and cooperate.
I think
not. As do we. It will be in the report. You've already nodded at us. So to move over to our closing question for our Zoom panelists, you are both joining us virtually thanks to technology, and so this feels very appropriate for both of you. But what do you think, on the basis of technology as it is being developed, technology we have not yet seen or not yet realized, such as digital worlds, digital societies, what are the future threats from disinformation in such spheres, not just coming from the disinformation sphere into the physical world, but also into virtual worlds as they emerge? Chris, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I've recently been writing about this and studying this. And I think, since time is short, I could talk for hours about it, but I think here's the important thing. We are coming to an age in the next few years where the divide in society will be between those who are living in reality and those who are choosing to live in an alternate reality, choosing to live in a metaverse, choosing to spend a lot of time with augmented reality. It's going to be very tempting, especially for citizens. Maybe you don't have the best job, maybe you don't have the best life, but you are everything and more that you ever wanted to be inside of that virtual reality world. And I think, all of the possibilities for manipulation, all the possibilities for not only manipulation, but to do micro-targeting of data, of how your eye moves and how large your iris gets. I mean, they're already doing studies on this. Going out to 2030, looking at brain-machine interfaces, where it's very possible in the next 10 years, someone in this room is going to be asked the question of, will you take an implant so that you can keep working here? I think the right to unplug is going to be a human rights discussion sometime in the next 10 years. So I've written a lot about it. I can drop some of those in for you later, but I would just say that that divide, that reality, unreality divide, it'll be a continuum for a lot of us. And I think that will largely define how we deal with the information space. And it's, how do we preserve democracy in that type of environment, I think is going to be an important question for people in this room to tackle.
Thank you, Chris. And you have not alleviated any of my anxiety that people will be watching me online, that they'll be tracking my eye movements. I've had to sit here for an hour and a half seeing my own head in the corner, and that has been hell already. So that it will be compounded is a nightmare. Christina, we started with you introducing you as a panelist. We're going to close with you. How would you see the evolution in the digital realm?
Yes, thank you, Adi, and I totally agree with Chris that very soon we would be having discussions about human rights and how are human rights directly impacted by cyber threats, by cyber violence, by disinformation, misinformation, and lack of information being present online, and how does that directly impact good governance, not just in democratic societies, but in every single society as a whole. And I think it's just crucially important to raise awareness about the resilience in this digital world, to raise awareness about this, not just hybrid threats, but fully digital threats online that are the reason different factors contribute actually to these kind of issues. And disinformation as a whole, something that we're struggling to debunk and tackle for years, comes from different factors, comes from different societies, comes from what people tend to believe in unreliable sources. So definitely I could maybe talk about this for hours, but just raising awareness about the cyber violence and the resilience that we have to work on is just crucially important. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, very sadly, I will bring this panel to a close. Thank you all for your contributions tonight. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for being here in person. It always feels special these days. Please join me in giving the panel a quick round of applause for their contributions. And thank you for everyone tuning into the live stream for tuning in and for participating even remotely. Chris, Christina, thank you so much. We hope to run into you and cross paths in person one of these days. However, even if it is only digital, we're a little closer to having the tools to do so effectively. And to everyone here in the room, hope to see you for the reception.